Good evening, everyone. How are you? Good. So good evening. I'm Bonnie Cannon. I'm the executive director of the Bridgehampton Childcare and Recreational Center. Welcome to our Thinking Forward lecture series, Equality Matters in the Hamptons. We are so proud of our community partnerships, and thank you, Guildhall, for caring about our kids and our community. This is our fourth lecture in this beautiful theater, and thank you, J.P. Morgan Chase, for sponsoring our lecture series. Let's give them a hand. We hope you enjoyed seeing some of our beautiful faces on the screen. The center has an after-school program, a teen college prep program, a low-cost summer camp, and our lecture series to educate, inspire, and open our eyes and hearts. Please get to know us, take home some information, look at our website, www.bhccrc.org. Better yet, stop by one day. We always say, just don't drive by, stop by. We need the support of our community, and we need your assistance. Because I'm not going to be able to speak to you at the end, I also want to say to you that with our partnership with Guildhall, our kids have worked with Guildhall here. If you went out in the gallery and you looked at the beautiful gallery that they have there, our kids actually participated in that exhibit. So some of the exhibits that you see are out there as well. The other invitation that I will give to you is on tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. at the center, our kids will be doing a fashion show of all recycled goods. So they're making outfits out of recycled goods, and I invite you to come to that. But at this time, I'm not going to prolong this event anymore, and I'm now going to present to you Ken Miller and Sherrilyn Ifill. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this lovely evening. Thank you, Bonnie, and PJ, Paul Jeffers, the chairman of the Bridgehampton Daycare Center. What you do for the community, you make it more humane, and it's good for everybody. And thank you, too, to LTV, Long Island Television, which is recording this session as they did last year's on the same topic, race in America and race in the Hamptons. The Hamptons, Long Island itself is one of the most segregated, one of the top 10 most segregated communities in America, and of course, the Hamptons is far from an exception. We have last year's session on the website of the center, and you can still see it there. And tonight's convening should be up in about a month. So what we're going to do tonight is Sherrilyn and I are going to talk for maybe up to an hour, and then Sherrilyn has agreed to take questions from the audience. It's such an honor to have a warrior like Sherrilyn Ifill, who's been so wonderful in the struggle for racial justice and human rights in America. And she has used both the law and the media as a very effective tool in that struggle. So there's a nice spirit in the hall. Why don't we just show a little more for Sherrilyn? Now, Sherrilyn, you wrote a very well-received book called On the Courthouse Lawn, and I thought maybe we could start our dialogue talking about that. The book deals with some of the lynchings that took place in the last century on the Maryland shore, and you got to writing it, no accident, through a lawsuit that you were asked to take on that had to do with the siting of a highway. The highway might have been, if it were successfully run right through the middle of the black community with horrible consequences for the community. Could you say a few words about what you learned and about that book, and then we can move into a bunch of other related topics?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you. Thank you, Ken, for inviting me and for those lovely words. Thank you all for the warm reception. And Bonnie, where's Bonnie? Where'd she go? Hey, thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here. Yes, it's actually interesting to talk about the book now. The 10th anniversary edition of the book was just released last year. Largely because of the work of Brian Stevenson at EJI and the creation of the Lynching Memorial at Montgomery, Alabama. And if you haven't been, you need to make your plans to go right away, which built quite a bit on the thesis of the book that I wrote 10 years ago and some of the research in it, and the central theme about the silence that surrounds historical incidents of racial violence that happened in this country. And I came to write the book because this was something I confronted again and again in my work. I had been a lawyer at the Legal Defense Fund, the organization I now lead, when I was a baby lawyer. And I was a voting rights lawyer then, in case you think these voting rights problems are of recent vintage, they are not. And when I would go into a community and would begin to work on a voting rights case, it almost always happened that I would hear some story about an incident of racial violence that happened in the past. So I had a voting rights case in Tulsa in 1991. I had never heard of the Tulsa race riots. And there was actually very little written about it at that time. But people in the community told me about this event that happened in 1921 when the black section of town, known as the Black Wall Street, very prosperous section, was burned down by a white mob. And so wherever I went, I would hear these stories. It wasn't about the case I was working on, but it was such a powerful narrative. People still remembered it, and I use the word remembered kind of loosely because the actual people didn't remember it, but it was like a community memory. It was a story that was passed down. When I went out to the Eastern Shore to work on this case that involved the plan to site Route 50, which was a highway that would take people out to Ocean City, the beach out on the eastern shore of Maryland, the plan that was presented and approved would have been actually directly adjacent to the African American community in Salisbury. But this was an extension of the same highway that had been run through the African American community in the 1960s in Salisbury. And when we started researching the case, I was now teaching at University of Maryland Law School and working with my students through an environmental justice clinic, we learned that there was yet another highway, Route 13, that had cut through the African American community in the early 1940s. So this was going to be the third time that this community had been chopped up. And you could even stand on the intersection of Route 13 and Route 50, and you could see, there'd be a church kind of hanging off the end of the side, the highway. I mean, you could really see how this community had been savaged by these highway siting decisions. And when I went into that community to begin talking about the litigation that we were filing in that case, I started to hear these stories about these two lynchings that happened in the community. So I continued working on the case, but then a few years into the case, I visited South Africa, which was then in its truth and reconciliation process. And I was actually super impressed with the level of open dialogue about race and about crimes, about racial pogroms that had happened, about forced removals, about violence. And I contrasted it with the experience I was having on the Eastern Shore, which was that African American people were secretly telling me the story of these two lynchings that happened in the 1930s. This was in the 1990s, so it's 60 years later, and it's almost like it's still a secret. And then in the white community, people would say that they kind of had heard that something happened, but they thought it was in the next county, or they weren't alive when it happened. And these were very small towns. The second lynching was attended by 2,000 people. In a town of 11,000 people, that's kind of a big deal.
And the where of the lynchings was very important.
Well, the name of the book is called On the Courthouse Lawn very deliberately because, so I'm from Queens. So I grew up hearing about lynchings as well, but my understanding of lynching was that it was something that happened in the woods.
With the Klan.
With the Klan, or some hillbillies or something. And when I was studying these two lynchings and then started to read accounts of lynchings, and I read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of accounts of lynchings, sadly, so often they happened on the front lawn of the county courthouse. So these were not secret events that happened somewhere in the woods that nobody knew about. The lynching of Matthew Williams that I wrote about in 1931, which took place on a Friday night, 8 o'clock, December 4th, he was dragged from the hospital through the streets to the courthouse lawn and hung on the courthouse lawn at the corner of Main and Division. And I think of the corner of Main and Division as being like the middle of America. And that's where this event happened.
And of course, the point of it was to send a message to both communities.
There were always message crimes. I mean, people ask, what makes a lynching different than a murder, right? When people murder somebody, mostly there is an air of secrecy they're trying to surround it with, right? They don't want to be caught. They try to hide the body. They try to get away. They don't want to be at the scene. Lynchings are very different. First of all, the display of the body is very important because it's not just about the attack on the individual. It's really first and foremost a message crime. And the message is a message about the boundaries of citizenship for Black people. And then the willingness to be seen is actually part of the terror because it's a reinforcement. It's saying, we know that we can get away with it. It sends a message of impunity about the crimes. And then I think even the location, the courthouse lawn, it was a way of saying we are in control of the justice system. It was actually a direct response to what they regarded as the deficiencies of the justice system.
And wouldn't you say that when it finally got to that point where the white community came out to the courthouse, sometimes the accused individual was inside the courthouse, and they would be a mob outside, it would be an attempt, and they would run through the Black community sometimes, terrorizing the Black community. So it wasn't just the individual involved, but it was a message to kind of everyone.
No question about it. That's why I talk about lynching pogroms. They very often were accompanied by a kind of savaging and ransacking of the Black community, burning out of Black businesses. People were afraid to come out. Families were afraid to come out and collect the body of their family member who had been lynched. There was an incredible amount of terror that was visited into the community that saw this. And I think it also cowed the former legal system. In some instances, law enforcement and prosecutors were actually involved. But in other instances, even where they weren't involved, they were cowed by the boldness of the crowd and the violence of the crowd into not doing their jobs.
Now, I think at one point somebody decided they wanted to put a statue up in honor of Frederick Douglass. But no, it was sacred ground, the courthouse lawn. You couldn't do that. Maybe you could say a few words about that.
Yeah, so the first chapter of the book came out of an incident that was happening while I was writing the book. So while I was writing the book in the town of Easton, which is in Talbot County on the Eastern Shore, there was a controversy within the town that many people were describing as the most difficult and controversial racial issue that had happened in that community in recent memory. So this is in 2003 or 2004. And the controversy was that there was a plan to put a statue of Frederick Douglass on the courthouse lawn in Easton. And Frederick Douglass, as you know, is an American hero. He's a personal, absolute hero of mine. I literally spent my last birthday at the Library of Congress reading the letters that he wrote, like after his meeting with President Lincoln, and so I revere him. Yes, I'm a nerd. And he was a slave on the Eastern Shore. And by the way, there's a lot of slavery denial in Maryland in general, but I always would say to people, who are the two most famous formerly enslaved persons that you can think of? And it's Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, and they were both slaves on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. So he was a slave in that county. He escaped, his story. He emerged to be a brilliant orator and abolitionist. And now there's going to be the statue. And there was resistance from the veterans group within the community who said that the courthouse lawn was hallowed ground. That was the word they used, sacred and hallowed ground, solely reserved for commemoration of war heroes, of former soldiers. And it is true that the Eastern Courthouse Lawn has several monuments on it, all of which are veterans memorials. There's a Korean Veterans Memorial, there's one for Vietnam War veterans, and there's also a statue that commemorates the Talbot boys, Talbot County. And it lists all of their names, and it has a little boy standing on the top of the monument. And the Talbot boys were a group of men in Talbot County who joined the Confederate Army. Now remember, Maryland was not part of the Confederacy, but they joined the Confederate Army. So those were, in fact, so the controversy was about, well, Frederick Douglass wasn't a veteran, and shouldn't this only be for veterans? And
but isn't it true that a couple of his boys fought in the Civil War, and that he recruited people to fight against the South?
So that was so one argument you could make is he was as good as a veteran, right? Because two of his sons fought in the Massachusetts 54th Regiment that you've seen in the film Glory. He was very instrumental in really pushing Lincoln to allow African Americans to serve in the Union Army. Lincoln wanted to give him a commission in the Army, but feared that it would be very controversial if white soldiers didn't listen to him. I mean, he was deeply engaged in these issues. And throughout his life, he later became postmaster. I mean, he was an extraordinary individual who served this country. And that was the argument that the local NAACP was making. You know, he's as good as a veteran. And I just kind of felt like there should be a different argument. And the argument I wanted to make, and which may be relevant to you and I think is relevant to how we think about our public space in this country, was that I wanted to challenge the idea of the courthouse lawn as hallowed ground and as a sacred place. And so the first chapter of my book, I wrote about a near lynching that happened. It didn't happen because the would-be victim got away. But in 1919, a man named Isaiah Fountain was accused of raping a 14-year-old girl, and he was put on trial on Easter Monday in 1919. And after the first day of trial, when the sheriff took him back into the jail inside the courthouse, a mob formed on the lawn of the courthouse, reported to be 2,000 men with ropes and knives. And Isaac Fountain saw the men outside. The sheriff tried to push him back into the jail. He made his way out the back and he ran all the way to Delaware. The local judge deputized a number of the townspeople to bring him back alive, which frankly saved his life. He was willing to pay them $250 to bring him back alive.
For a moment.
And that's what happened on that courthouse lawn. So I wanted to interrogate the question of who decides how we define the public space and the significance of public space in our communities.
You know, that's a good segue. I was going to talk about this later, but when you mention public space, I think one of the things that the Legal Defense Fund, or maybe just you, comment on is the decline of the importance of a public space in the more figurative sense, that we make a huge emphasis on private ownership of mansions and cars and things. And the white community is extremely protective of that ownership. So maybe you want to say a few words about that.
I do. This is my, if I'm going to preach a gospel, it's this one. It's the gospel of the public good. Because I actually think it lies at the core of many of the most volatile issues that we face in this country that divide us, is that we have lost a sense of the public good. And instead we have come, as you say, to lionize that which is private. What I find most concerning about it is that one of the reasons that this has been a successful project is because whatever is public has now become racialized. So if I say public schools, you probably have an image in your head of who's in those schools. If I say that, we're going to put something on the ballot to determine whether or not we're going to tax you for public transportation, you probably have an idea who might be taking that public transportation as well. We've come to see the public as being tainted by race. And the private is exalted. Private schools, private universities, getting in your car and driving. Now, I will tell you, the one place that I think is ahead of the game on some of this, certainly where it comes to public transportation, is New York. It's one of the reasons why you should hold on to it. But it is true that in Maryland, for example, where I lived for a long time, that to say you were going to, to impose a tax to support public transportation versus build a tax to build a highway has racial connotations to it. People know exactly what that means. And yet it is the public space where we interact with each other. It is the public space where, unless you have decided that you're going to come out to an event like tonight, you are forced into proximity with people who live differently than you, and you have to figure out how to negotiate that space together. It may be annoying to be on the subway, as I frequently am, cheek by jowl with strangers, but there is also something about it in that we are all containing ourselves and managing ourselves in a way to make this work for all of us. And that project of the public good, of what it means for us to accept limitations on ourselves, to extend grace to one another, to be interested in someone else's experience, to have to cede the legitimacy of someone else's ability to stand next to you on the subway, even though it feels too close and you'd rather actually be standing on your own. All of that is a psychological project that builds strong societies. And we have allowed that to be corrupted and to be undermined. And we have become resentful of it. We don't want to pay any money to support the public good. But for my own life, I can tell you, I come from a very large family, 10 kids. I'm the youngest. We lived we so powerfully engaged with the public. We didn't go on vacations out of the country. We went to state parks. I had my 35-cent token in those days, and that meant that even though I lived in Queens, I could get to my summer job in Harlem. I went to public schools, K through 12, and had the best public school education you could possibly have in that brief period in which many New York City public schools were integrated in the 1970s.
Well, who controls the public space has a lot to do with voting. And I know voting is, of the 4 areas that the Legal Defense Fund focuses on, is probably at the apex of the pyramid. And I wanted to talk to you about what, at least at first, appeared to be one of your great victories, which was the Presidential Advisory Committee on Election Integrity. Sounds like a good thing, but it wasn't. It was headed up by a guy named Chris Kobach. Trump was promoting it, and its purpose was voter suppression. And while the case, it wasn't a victory in the court, he threw in the towel on that one. Maybe you could say a few words about that, and then we can pick up with what happened after the towel was thrown in.
Yeah. Right after the election, actually before the election, but certainly right after the election, you all will recall that President Trump had a little difficulty accepting that he had lost the popular vote. And so he began insisting on this narrative that the election, there was this election fraud and that 3 million votes were cast illegally. And you remember I think it was people coming from New Hampshire to Massachusetts or Massachusetts to New Hampshire, and there were all these votes in California and so forth. And he had talked about this a little bit before the election, but he really began to pump it up after the election. And Stephen Miller, his aide, who is really, in fact, a white supremacist on his staff, really insisted on this as well. And he created this so-called Election Integrity Commission. The co-chairs were Chris Kobach, who's the former Secretary of State of Kansas, who has been the nemesis of voting rights for a very long time. He has used all kinds of tactics.
He's the worst.
He is literally the worst. Everyone on this commission was literally like the rogues gallery of voter suppression. I mean, it was just unbelievable. And so it was Ken Blackwell from Ohio, who people may remember. It was Vice President Pence was the co-chair. I mean, it was, you just couldn't make it up. So we sued, and there were 8 lawsuits challenging the creation of this commission. We did something that, in our lawsuit, that was not raised in the other lawsuits, and that actually we have never done before, which was that we sued the President of the United States. I think we have sued one other President of the United States on a procedural ground. But we sued the President of the United States, and we sued him on the grounds that he had engaged in intentional discrimination. It's a big deal, right? And I think it's interesting right now, the conversation about, is Trump racist, is he not racist? So we kind of sued him the first year of his presidency, in which essentially what we said was that this decision was motivated by racial discrimination, that this was a way to try and challenge African American and Latino voters, and the information they were trying to gather was for the purpose of cascading it down to voter suppressors who work around the country to try and use that data to suppress African American votes. And that was kind of the first signal that, like, we had to change, because as I said, this was very new. Most of what we do is that we challenge state and local governments who are engaged in discrimination. Sometimes it's private parties in cases of employment discrimination or housing discrimination. But since January 2017, we have sued 6 cabinet members. This is unheard of in our history. We sued Ben Carson twice. We sued Homeland, we sued Kristen Nielsen, who's the head of Homeland Security. We sued the Commerce Department around the census issue. We sued Betsy DeVos, the Education Secretary. We've sued the Department of Justice for failing to provide us with information about one of our licenses. So this is not I actually don't say this lightly, because it's actually a quite astonishing transformation, and it has exposed us to the retaliation of people who support this president. And so, we have been subjected to crazy cyber attacks, and I mean, it's real. It's very real having to respond to this moment.
What they do with language is so frightening. The idea of an election integrity when the purpose is exactly the opposite. But anyway, you and your fellow plaintiffs got them to the point where his next statement on the subject was, well, to save the taxpayer money, I'm going to shut this commission down. He
said uncle, and it was going to cost him a pretty penny, I can assure you, because we were determined to continue to litigate this suit. And we were doing a pretty good job between the 8 suits of really covering the waterfront, and we would have had access to the information. And so he disbanded the commission, much like the census suit, which is why I knew he was going to throw in the towel on the census suit after the Supreme Court's decision, and despite all the blustering he did for 2 weeks, he eventually did.
But Sherrilyn, he never loses, you see, because when he threw in the towel to save the taxpayer money, he and Kobach, who they referred it to the Department of Homeland Security. It was such an important national security issue to make sure that only the right people voted. And Kobach became an advisor to the Department of Homeland Security on this issue. And then I lost track of it, but I'll bet you didn't.
No, it continues. And you may have seen the president's tweets the last 2 days are all about the need for a federal voter ID law. So that's his new thing. And you know that we have been pushing, Senator McConnell has refused to allow several bills that would help secure our election from foreign attack to be voted on in the Senate. I mean, this is actually, frankly, astonishing. It's great to talk about Trump, but it's pretty astonishing that there are bills that have passed in the House and that actually have bipartisan support in the Senate that Mitch McConnell will not allow a vote on that's designed to protect our vote against foreign hacking and influence. And he won't allow it to come to the fore. And so now what the president said the last 2 days is, well, if you're going to do it, because I think they feel the pressure on McConnell, you should tie it to a federal voter ID provision.
Right. Unbelievable. Well, you used to get support from the federal government for voting rights cases, but you don't anymore. And the quality of the judges that he's nominating to the federal bench, they're inexperienced, and their politics are in some cases, forgive the expression, deplorable. Maybe you'd comment on that.
Well, this is one of the most important areas of work that, unfortunately, people just have difficulty sustaining their attention to it, and that is the appointments to the federal bench. In fact, this is the reason why many Republicans and conservatives who know better, who actually know that this president is a wrecking ball on this democracy, support him because they believe that they are at least getting conservative judges appointed to the bench and that this will allow their ideology to have power for decades to come. And I want to first of all say I don't apologize for resisting and opposing judges who hold an ideology that is contrary to the civil rights issues that I stand for and believe in and have fought for. But that's kind of routine. Like, that is just the way it goes, right? There are judges that are more liberal, there are judges that are more conservative, and those battles we know of quite well. This is actually quite different, what is happening at this moment. Not only are these judges conservative, but they're beyond conservative. So we have a whole tranche of judges who have refused under oath to say that Brown versus Board of Education was correctly decided. Now that's a pretty low bar, right? That's deciding whether or not segregation can be legally enforced by the state, racial segregation. You don't get, and so for those who have said it was correctly decided, they don't get a gold star either, because that's a very low bar. But the point is that we now have judges who refuse to say that Brown was correctly decided. We have judges who have been actively defending voter suppression in the states that they come from. We have judicial nominees, actually one was just confirmed, who are virulently anti-LGBTQ. These are not judges before whom any of my clients would believe they could get a fair shake. And the key to judges is that they must be impartial. So I want to say one more thing. The other feature that I think, regardless of your ideology, should bother you, is that the competence level of these judges is beyond anything I have ever seen, and I have been in this for 30 years. So judges we have one up right now for a seat in Kentucky from Mitch McConnell's state, who was rated not qualified by the American Bar Association. Now, that's a hard thing to do. The American Bar Association is nonpartisan. You can get not qualified, qualified, well qualified. Most judges get at least, judicial nominees get at least qualified. You wouldn't even put a nominee up who wasn't qualified. But increasingly we're seeing nominees who are not qualified to be federal judges. To be a federal judge was largely considered something that happened later in your career after you had distinguished yourself in the profession in some way, in academia, at a law firm, in government, in some way distinguished yourself. Many of you may have seen the video, was it last year or 2 years ago, of one judicial nominee, Matthew Peterson, who couldn't answer any questions, remember? And he was asked by a Republican, Representative Kennedy, Senator Kennedy from Louisiana. And it turns out he had never filed a motion. He had never argued in court. It was not clear to me that he had ever actually entered a courthouse. And okay, so the video went viral, and it was funny because it was awful. But it should have alarmed you. The question is, how did he end up at a hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee? Because remember, you first have to fill out an extremely onerous questionnaire if you are nominated to sit on the federal bench. And that questionnaire asks everything about you, every place you've ever lived, and it asks about everything you've ever worked on. And one of the most important questions is a question that asks you to list the 10 most important matters that you personally litigated. So first of all, it presumes that there are at least 10. It presumes that you personally litigated them. So I went back to look at his questionnaire because I'm thinking, how do you make it to the chair if obviously you haven't litigated anything? Why are we all laughing at this video? So he had been in the counsel's office for the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, and among the cases that he listed that he personally litigated was Citizens United. Because I guess he was in the counsel's office when the FEC was litigating that case. So we have people who are incompetent, but who are also giving misleading answers on a questionnaire that they sign under penalty of perjury to sit on the federal bench.
The United States has a view of itself that we are exceptional. And I think in your view, if we have any claim to that, a key element would be the 14th Amendment. But you may want to say a few words about that, but I can't resist getting into this moment in American history. I know you're not a historian, but how exceptional would you say this moment is? I mean, of the first 12 presidents of the United States, 10 were slave owners, and we could come right up through the present. Recently, a tape was made public where Ronald Reagan is exchanging racist remarks with then President Nixon, who repeats them in another context. What would you say? People argue about whether Trump is a racist. I don't think it's much of an argument, but it's one of the hopes we have about this discussion tonight is that people of goodwill who are in this room will understand how deeply embedded and how structural racism is in this country. In that vein, is Trump a symptom, a cause? How unusual do you think this moment is?
So yeah, that's a really great question. Because I know a lot of people say, including my own community, you know, we've been here before and, you know, we're going to survive this moment. And I guess I want to push back against that a little bit. I mean, I prefer not to make the comparison slavery because, again, the low bar. Yes, it is true. We know that so many of our early presidents were slave owners. We know about the terrible compromise that was made in our Constitution. I taught constitutional law for many years, and one of the exercises I would have my students do is to go through the original Constitution and find where the Constitution mentions the word slavery, which of course it does not in the original Constitution. Not that it doesn't talk about slavery, but it doesn't use the word slavery because they knew it was wrong. And so it says things like, the migration and importation of persons, right? So they knew it was wrong. Okay, I think what we have to remember is that there was a second founding in this country. And that's where talking about the 14th Amendment comes in. The Civil War ended, and we hit the reset button on this country. And the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, I regard the 14th Amendment as the most important text of the Constitution. It touches every single person who's sitting in this room. Unless you are Native American, the reason that you are American is because of the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment explicitly guaranteed in its first line that every person born in the United States or naturalized is a citizen of the United States. That completely transformed the character of this nation. It created the 19th and 20th century America that allowed people to come from another country, and in one generation, their kids were Americans and they could regard themselves as Americans. It was designed to ensure that newly freed slaves and free blacks, because the Dred Scott case had deemed that no black person could be a citizen of the United States. So it was designed to ensure that black people were citizens. But like with all efforts that expand equality, it ended up touching everyone. So the 14th Amendment is powerful. It's a complete reset. The 13th Amendment ends slavery. 14th Amendment provides birthright citizenship. It is the first place in the Constitution that equal protection is discussed, that every person is entitled to equal protection of laws. Not every citizen. Not every citizen. Meaning if you are in the borders of the United States, you are entitled to the equal protection of the laws. For people who are walking around making it as though people who are immigrants and who are undocumented are not entitled to equal protection of the laws, that is not true. It explicitly talks about due process. So this is a powerful, and that's the reset button. So if we want to take it from that period forward, then I would put Trump on the level with Andrew Johnson, who was impeached in part because he was such a virulent racist. This was President Lincoln's vice president, who took over after Lincoln was assassinated. Lincoln picked him in that effort to try and balance the ticket. One of the fascinating things I read on my birthday last year at the Library of Congress was Frederick Douglass talking about the difference between Lincoln and Johnson, and how what the meeting with Johnson was like, and how he wanted it to be clear the disrespect he had for black people when Frederick Douglass went to see him.
Who?
Andrew Johnson. And by contrast, what it was like when he went to see, there's a beautiful passage, forgive me, I digress, but I must. There's a beautiful passage in which Frederick Douglass talks about a meeting he's having with Lincoln that runs over time. And there's another visitor who comes to see Lincoln whose time it is to visit with the president. And Lincoln tells him, wait, I'm speaking to Frederick Douglass, I'm going to finish this meeting. The person who's waiting is a governor, I think it was a governor of Connecticut. And Frederick Douglass talks about the day that a governor had to wait because the president was talking to a black man. That's how much he felt about the way he was regarded by Lincoln as opposed to Johnson. So I'm going to put Woodrow Wilson right under them. You know what I mean? But if we're taking it from that period, this is exceptional. And it's not only exceptional that there can be one person, a president, who is virulently racist. It is the ways in which he has taken the entire federal government apparatus with him and encouraged people to reject the norms, values, and ethics that was part of what protected us. And then the second piece that I think is the part that we should remember and that resonates really powerfully is that this president has removed shame around racism.
Yeah, but you know what's weird is that he doesn't like to be called a racist.
Oh, poor thing. Well,
I know, but I'm just saying.
Actually, I disagree with that. He doesn't like to be called a racist by white people because, as I said, we sued him pretty early on. He was denounced after he took out that full-page ad in the paper saying that the Central Park Five should receive capital punishment. I mean, this is not someone who has not been subject to this kind of criticism. And the president can't take any criticism. But you know what? The reason why it's interesting that it bothers him so much is because it bothers a lot of people. And that's something we also need to talk about, that it has become taboo to honestly identify racism. And in fact, you are vilified as the person who calls out racism. And this is so insane that actually we have to get hold of ourselves. It's like a crazy emotional response. The thing I love about being a civil rights lawyer is that in the past 4 years, we have won 3 cases in which we have proved, in which a federal court has found that a policy was created for the purpose of discriminating against black people. So the great thing about being a civil rights lawyer is you can actually prove it in court. And then it's not me saying it. Even if I would say it, it's more important that a federal court in Texas said that Texas's voter ID law was passed for the purpose of discriminating against African American and Latino voters. It's more important that a federal judge in Alabama said that the city of Gardendale attempting to secede from the school district and take with them the magnet high school was done for the purpose of discriminating against black students. It's actually more important that a federal judge in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, said that the city of Terrebonne or the parish of Terrebonne, Louisiana, maintained a system of electing judges for the purpose of keeping black people from being able to elect a candidate to the judicial bench. Do people know that that's happening? That we're actually proving those cases? Racism is not just some emotional thing that we're picking out of the sky. We actually prove it.
Now, I'm going to get to asking you about reparations. You know, Sherrilyn doesn't know anything I'm going to, in the interest of spontaneity, I didn't tell her what I was going to ask her about. And I know that in addition to voting rights, criminal justice, economic justice, and education are important to you and to LDF. And so before we get to reparations, maybe you want to say something about structural, systemic racial prejudice in those areas. I know it's not fair in the short amount of time we have, but...
It's a small seminar. I'll keep it brief. So one of the difficulties of talking about race in this country is that we have allowed racism to be defined as something that is about good people and evil people and about feelings. And I'm mostly interested in policies and practices and laws. The work that we do, one of the great things about being involved as a civil rights lawyer, but also in a legacy civil rights organization that's been around for a long time, and I tell this to our staff of lawyers, that that's our job. Our job is to be able to see racism in its structural forms and to see the scaffolding of inequality, that people are just going about their lives and you can't see it, but it's our job to see it. It's kind of like the Courthouse Lawn. When I'm traveling the country, I kind of know a lot about lynching. And so what I see in these very sweet little towns where I often stop and have a cup of coffee is very different than what you might see if you were in this nice little square. And that's my job. My job is to see that structure. And it's important because racism is hiding in plain sight. If you are a historian, if you're interested in history, if you're going to buy the New York Times, the Sunday New York Times this weekend, and you're going to have the magazine, which is devoted to something called the 1619 Project, which is commemorating the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first African slaves on this shore 400 years ago, there's going to be essay after essay after essay and history that you should digest and that you should read and that you should disseminate about that history. And that history is hiding in plain sight, and it's all around us. And our job as civil rights lawyers is to see that and to begin to dismantle what those structures are. It doesn't mean that there are not people who are not perpetrating racism, and we deal with that as well. If you take the case of housing, yes, suing someone like a Donald Trump, as the Justice Department did, and the Trump Organization for engaging in discrimination in the apartments that they rented in New York in the 1970s, that is a form of racism in which it doesn't get worse than that, right? Where, the applications would come in and, the Trump folks would put C on the application for colored for black people and not rent to them like that. Okay, so that's real, and actually that kind of explicit racism still exists and is in fact on the rise again. But there's also structural racism, and structural racism is when you perpetuate decisions that were made, laws that were enacted, policies that advanced a racial hierarchy. And that's the part I think people have trouble with and sometimes are resistant to seeing. I want to commend to you a book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Came out 2 years ago. It was longlisted for the National Book Award. And he was a fellow at LDF in our Thurgood Marshall Institute because we care so much about reacquainting Americans with the history of housing discrimination. And this is focused on housing discrimination in the North. And it is there to help you understand that the entire landscape of the North was largely created by the decisions of the federal government and the policies of the federal government, which at least until the early 1960s were explicitly racially discriminatory, right? So that means that the tax breaks that was given for the development of places like Levittown, the federal government would only do it on a racially segregated basis. They would not allow integrated housing. Public housing, the deal with public housing was struck that it would be racially segregated in order to get public housing built. When the federal government began providing loans for mortgages, it was done on a racially segregated basis. It was required. They would not give you a loan to move into a neighborhood that was not the neighborhood of your race. The government had sample racially restrictive covenants for you to place in the deed. This is the federal government in the North.
This is after World War II.
This is before World War II and after
World War II.
Into the 1960s. There's a reason why the Fair Housing Act was the last of the civil rights amendments, civil rights pieces of legislation passed in the 1960s, and it was passed a week after the assassination of Martin Luther King in shame by one vote. Because that was the thing he was working on, because his focus on poverty and his focus on segregation. And when the city started to burn after his assassination, there was a push to pass the Fair Housing Act. And it has never fully been realized because the resources have never been put into the Fair Housing Act to deal with the structural piece I'm talking about. So what we do in America is like when we discover that we're doing something, even when we win our cases, what people like to do is to just stop doing the thing they were doing. Not to actually go back and figure out how do you undo. Because that stratification, if you grew up in Levittown, as someone like, say, Bill O'Reilly did, or if you were a beneficiary of the GI Bill, black GIs also could access the GI Bill. But with the GI Bill, if you got the benefits of the GI Bill, what universities could you go to in the South? Could you go to the University of Alabama? No. If you were able to access the GI Bill to get a home loan, where could you live in Chicago? Right? There were particular places you could live. And if we now trace the value of the homes from the neighborhoods that you could access with the GI Bill as a white GI, compared to where you were compelled to live as a black GI, if we look at the value of your degree in terms of what the schools you were able to go to and the schools you were not able to go to, when we begin to talk about the inheritance of that wealth gap, that's what we're looking at. And so when people say, you know, I didn't do anything, I'm innocent, I'm a good person, you may be a good person, but you are an inheritor of policies and practices that were perpetuated by the federal government that maybe unwittingly your grandparents and great-grandparents didn't realize that they were beneficiaries of. Maybe they did, but they were. It's just a fact. There's nothing emotional associated with it. It's just real. And the question then for me is, how do we deal with that? And I'm going to segue to reparations, because this is my view about reparations extends from this history.
Press on.
I think of reparations more as about investments in policy. So I think of policy as largely about investments. America's always making investments. It doesn't matter what we say about how much money we have, whether we're trying to balance the budget, whether we're in deficit land or not, we're always making investments. We're making investments because we're going to war. We're making investments because we've decided that we have to deal with a particular scourge or a particular issue in our country. We're always making investments. And some of those investments have good intentions or sound great. The GI Bill is an investment. The investment was that these GIs have fought in the war, and when they come home, we want them to have a chance. And many of these GIs were people who did not come from middle-class homes, and we wanted the opportunity for them to move into the middle class. The creation of the interstate highway system was a great idea. I'm on the interstate highway all the time. I'm glad it's there, right? But it wasn't made for me. It made the creation of the white suburbs possible. You could not have grown up the white suburbs exponentially in the way that we did in the 1950s and the 1960s without the creation of the interstate highway. And it was a massive investment in public infrastructure. So we make investments all the time. And my view is that given this history that I've just described, in which for decades we have made massive investments in elevating the white population by making the white suburbs possible, by elevating white GIs, that's created the racial wealth gap, we also have the ability to make investments today that would begin to address the consequences of that disparity. That's how I think of reparations. I don't think about it as a check for individuals. I think about it as the policies that we have the ability to create. Look, we made an investment 30 years ago in mental health issues, in poverty, in young people. It was a massive investment. And that investment was in the prison system and in the criminal justice system, right? We built all these prisons. Remember when it was great, President Clinton said 100,000 new police officers. These are all investments. You paid for all this, I paid for all of this, and we were cool, apparently, with it. But we used that to warehouse the problem of mental illness, to warehouse the problem of poverty, to warehouse the problem of young people without jobs. Instead, we just created a massive criminal justice system. We have the same ability to decide that that was a wrong investment, and that instead we're going to invest in a different way. And so if we're going to have a conversation about reparations, it requires first the unearthing of this history so that people can understand it. Then it requires an understanding of how we make investments in this country and the kinds of investments we've made. It requires a true reckoning of the contributions of free and underpaid labor that have happened in this country. And then it's a conversation about policy. It's no different than the policy conversations that we have. We stood up in very short order something called a Department of Homeland Security that had never existed before after 9/11. A whole cabinet department, $9 billion. We just decided that that's what we needed. So I don't really want to hear we can't, and how are we going to do it, and how are we going to pay for it, I just think that's a way of avoiding the fact that there has been a massive underinvestment to make up for the wrong that happened, and we haven't begun to approach it yet.
That topic of reparations leads to such important and interesting discussions, but we don't have time to go as deep into it as we should. I think we should open the floor for questions, but since Frederick Douglass has been so present this evening, I thought I would share with you a quote that I came across in preparing for this discussion by Frederick Douglass, who said, "No man can put a chain about the ankle of his fellow man without at last finding the other end fastened about his own neck." So it's structural and it's deep, and everyone in this room, I think, is of goodwill and struggling to discover what to do about it. You know, we've had suggestions made that black people should return to Africa. In fact, in that 1619 magazine that you're talking about, I think at one point Lincoln may have suggested that as a possibility.
It's why the 14th Amendment was so important. There was a very thoroughgoing repatriation movement, and that's why the birthright citizenship piece was so powerful and so important.
Which makes it very difficult for black Americans to balance the sense of outrage and injustice with love of country. And whites have a huge problem, because when you've wronged someone, you always fear that they may want to get even. So we've got a tough problem on our hands, and in that vein, let me open the floor to questions. There's microphones. Please, when you rise to ask a question, just state your name.
Francesca Rhiannon. I'm just thank you so much for such a brilliant and compelling analysis of so many things. I think one of, in the light of what you just talked about in terms of reparations, which makes all the sense in the world to me, I think that, you know, we often hear this kind of contradiction between redressing racial wrongs and addressing class issues. And I always, you know, I think that racism is very tied to divide and conquer. I mean, that there's a purpose to it. So how do we bring the ideas together of redressing class inequity with addressing racial inequity?
So that's a great question. So it bears talking a little bit about what Du Bois called the wages of whiteness. You know, there has been a kind of a feeding to the white community of a psychological wage of superiority. And it has led many white people to make terrible decisions about the support for policies and practices that actually would undermine many of these class differences. At every turn, we have seen circumstances in which, even where it was beginning to happen, the connection between African Americans and poor whites, which should logically actually be standing shoulder to shoulder, has been broken by the idea that you know, you can still be better than somebody, no matter how low you are, and the willingness of people to be attracted to that. So there really does have to be a conversation about that, about the psychological ways. I look at some of the policies that President Trump is advancing that actually is not helpful to people who are low income, who are white. And yet they will support him because he is articulating something that is psychologically satisfying to them, to people who feel that they don't want to be policed anymore in what they say. They feel that they're constantly in the wrong. They feel their dignity is being challenged. They feel fearful about their numbers. And so we just have to have that conversation about that, all of what I just described. And those are bad motivations for policy decisions and for the people that you politically support. It's just bad. It's just bad for your own interests, for your children's interests, for your grandchildren's interests, and for the interests of this country. So So we've got people making bad decisions that come out of that emotional well. And then we also have people who are constantly, this is the world I live in, where people are constantly saying, well, it's class, not race. Race exists as an independent factor for all the reasons that I have just described. It exists that way because people are addicted to it, and because people will make decisions that are contrary even to their economic interests, right? You see this, where people don't want to be, where store owners don't, even if you're going to spend a lot of money, they don't want to be associated with having black people in the store because they believe that somehow lessens their brand. We actually filed a case against a little store called Wet Seal, which I don't even think exists anymore, but it used to be in malls all over the place. It probably was out here too, and my teenage daughters used to go there all the time, and I hated their clothes. But anyway, we filed a suit against Wet Seal because they had a policy of trying to remove black women managers from the floor because they thought that it diminished their brand. I mean, this kind of thinking is like, that has nothing to do with whether it is in fact economic or not, economically helpful or not. So there is a piece of this that gets bundled in, and I think we have to have clarity about what that is. This goes back to what I was saying about birthright citizenship. The opening the window of equality and access actually is the rising tide that lifts all boats, right? It is actually not trickle-down economics. It's actually that. I often talk about a case that LDF litigated in 1971 on behalf of a white woman, Ida Phillips. Phillips versus Martin Marietta. We argued her case in the Supreme Court and won. Why did we take the case? We took the case because we understood that the equality principle in the case was vital and important. And this was just at the time that Title VII was emerging, and we wanted to manage and be part of how the courts were interpreting this concept of employment discrimination. Ida Phillips applied for a job at Martin Marietta in Georgia, and she was denied the job because she had preschool-age children. And the policy of Martin Marietta was that they did not hire women who had preschool-age children on the theory that they should be home taking care of their kids. So we argued and won that case in the Supreme Court on behalf of Ida Phillips. This is LDF, an organization whose mission is racial justice. It was argued by Bill Robinson, an African-American lawyer. And so any white woman who's in corporate America today, or whose mom was in corporate America, who has preschool-age children, you benefited from the work of the Legal Defense Fund. So if we are opening that door to equality, it actually is helping other groups and other people, and it is lifting all boats. So I say lean in to the opening of access, because ultimately it actually does create the principles and the values. If we think about all of the principles and values of equal protection, of due process, these are things that everyone benefits from, that the government can't take something from you without giving you a chance to come to court and defend yourself, or a chance to explain it. I mean, these are all things that we all benefit from.
Another question?
Thank you. The voters of Florida in
You are Matt Mallow.
I am Matt Mallow, yes. The voters of Florida in 2018 passed a ballot initiative changing the Florida Constitution, restoring the rights of felons who had served their sentence to vote. The legislature of Florida and the governor have done their utmost to pass legislation requiring the repayment of costs by the former felons before they can vote, which I concede the scaffolding of voter suppression and a poll tax. What is LDF doing about that? And in that vein, that would benefit all racial groups who happen to fall within the category of former felons.
Well, I'm so glad you raised that. So we were waiting. We knew what was going to happen, and we were waiting, and so that Friday night, we weren't expecting it that Friday night, I admit, but no sooner did the governor sign that legislation requiring the repayment of fines and fees, then 3 hours later we filed suit. It was LDF, the ACLU, the Brennan Center. I really commend you to go to our website and look at the complaint, because it exemplifies exactly what you've described. And you look at our plaintiffs, they are African-American grandmothers and grandfathers. They are white men and white women in their 30s. It runs the gamut. And so we filed suit. we just sought a preliminary injunction last week. There are groups that are working to try to pay the fines and fees, but again, that doesn't deal with the structural problem, right? That's just, it's very nice to have a very wealthy person help pay the fines and fees, right? Or to have a whole lot of people contribute to pay the fines and fees. But what we want is for the will of the Florida voters who passed that referendum, and the ability of formerly incarcerated people to be able to exercise their right to vote. So what did we do? We filed suit, and we're pressing ahead with that. And we filed the preliminary injunction because we want this resolved before the 2020 election.
John McAuliffe, I want to go back to the earlier part of your discussion, which is judges. Let's just hope and imagine that the election has happened. We have a different party in control of the Senate, and we have a different president. How much how can the damage be undone? Can some of these judges be removed, or are they untouchable in effect? Is it a question of a high priority of the Democratic Party having to put new judges in? Is there anything that can be done about the Supreme Court balance?
So I should first say that LDF is a 501c3 organization and a nonpartisan organization. I'm actually old enough to, even in voting rights cases, have actually sued Democrats. So I want to preface my remarks with that. That being said, it is an excellent question that you ask, and obviously is one that concerns us. These are the judges we have to appear before. President Trump has had the ability to really stack the bench. Let me talk about the lower federal courts before I get to the Supreme Court. It's the courts of appeals and the district courts. There is no question that if President Trump is not elected and a Democrat is elected president, filling seats on the courts has to be one of the top priorities. It's also true that for many years the courts have been understaffed, and so increasing the number of judges on the courts of appeals and in the district courts actually is something that should be thought about and considered, not really necessarily for court packing, but because that has been an issue for a very long time that actually Chief Justice Roberts and other leaders of the profession have talked about, the need to increase judges. So there may be many more seats to fill, but whoever is the president has to prioritize that. And the Senate has to prioritize it. And therein lies the rub. Because even if the reason that President Trump had so many seats is because even though he was the president, Mitch McConnell was the Senate Majority Leader. And once the Democrats lost the Senate, and he would slow walk these judicial nominations and not allow them through, and that left so many seats open for Trump. So if the Democrats don't win the Senate, not very much is going to change in any substantial way in terms of being able to move the judiciary. In terms of the Supreme Court, I'm not even sure what to say. This has been a very, very difficult year, this last year. And it may get worse before it gets better. But it is what it is. I'm not a court packer myself. And so that's not something I necessarily embrace. But I do think that it is important for whoever becomes the next president and whoever is in charge of the next Senate to take very seriously how important it is to be preparing and thinking about the Supreme Court. For my own purposes, I actually worry a lot about the trial courts, which don't get a lot of attention, the district courts. It's actually very hard to overturn a trial court's decision that is based on the facts, and a lot of the work that we do, racial discrimination work, is fact-based. And increasingly, the incompetent judges that I talked about are being appointed to the district court bench, judges who have no experience trying cases, who now will be overseeing the trying of cases. So I'm actually deeply worried about what's happening on the district courts. But I'm answering you this way because I do not think we should pretend that we are not at a very perilous moment where the federal judiciary is concerned. I do think that it can be salvaged at this point, but I do think that it is headed in a direction that is quite alarming. And it's the reason why, even though the Republicans are in control of the Senate and many of these nominees are so terrible, we still have to apply the pressure. This is still about the rule of law in this country. I am appalled that people think it's okay for the President of the United States to essentially allow another organization, in this case the Federalist Society, to basically kind of off-site the preparation of judicial nominees. I would not want, President Obama did not call up the Legal Defense Fund and say, I want you to give me a list of judicial nominees. He didn't offload it to us. It is the job of the president and his counsel to work on those nominations. Doesn't mean we don't try to influence the process. Doesn't mean the Federalist Society shouldn't try to influence the process. But the idea that they create a list and the president chooses from that list, I mean, these are things that I just think are corrosive of our democracy. And we have to really take it seriously.
Sherrilyn, before we leave the subject of the Supreme Court, you use the expression the rule of law. We all learn about that in law school. What does the rule of law mean for racial justice, and what does the rule of law mean to the black community? Do you think that the Supreme Court believes in the rule of law? Say a few words about the rule of law in a racial context.
It's actually interesting. I mean, this would be this, that if we're going to do another talk like tomorrow night, it would be like the rule of law and racial justice, because you have to remember the tradition I come from. When Thurgood Marshall, LDF was founded in 1940. So 1940 is, 16 years before Rosa Parks, refused to move to the back of the bus, right? It's 15 years before Emmett Till was killed. When Thurgood Marshall, I often talk about Thurgood Marshall's effort to desegregate universities and law schools, and one of my favorite stories is that when he was litigating the case challenging segregation at the University of Oklahoma Law School, he represented a woman named Ada Lewis Sipowell, who had applied to the law school, and he tried the case in Oklahoma, and I actually spoke with her when I first came to the Legal Defense Fund many, many years ago, when she was still alive. And she told me the story that at the end of the first day of trial, it had not occurred to Marshall or to her that they would not be allowed to eat in the cafeteria of the federal courthouse. This is in 1949. And so Marshall said, tomorrow I'll try the case and you bring the bologna sandwiches. And she told me, this as a kind of a joke, because Marshall had that sense of humor. Okay, it's kind of a joke, but it's kind of like not a joke. But it also is, the way I've chosen to take the story is what it means to be a civil rights lawyer like Marshall and Robert Carter and Constance Baker Motley, and to be creating something for which there is no blueprint. Creating a vision and a imagination of what equality could look like out of your own head, out of your own sense of what those words are supposed to mean. They weren't modeling it on some other country that was doing it. They weren't doing it because America was fair to them. Even though they couldn't eat the sandwich in the cafeteria, they were still doing it. So our work and our belief in the possibilities of the rule of law, because as an African American, you can only believe in the possibilities of what could happen in this country, in the promise, has never been premised on whether or not we're being in fact treated right, right? It has always required a suspension of belief. And it's always required you to look past what is in front of you to the horizon you're trying to get to. So I would probably, do like a whole demonstration around the fact that I couldn't eat in the cafeteria. Marshall did not, because he had a plan and a strategy for how he was challenging segregated education, and he worked that strategy. So what does the rule of law mean? It's tough. It's really tough at this moment, and this is what I worry about, and I'm really pushing the leaders of my profession, the lawyers and the partners at law firms, and the people who lead our profession and who make a lot of money in this profession, because they are the people who press the issue of the rule of law. They've created many of the mores and ethics that we are all supposed to believe in, and that I have adopted, and that we insist that our lawyers follow. And that we insist so where are they? Where are their voices at a moment when the rule of law is being threatened. The rule of law is not a civil rights concept. And it's being turned into that by the fact that so many are silent. When Don McGahn, former president's counsel, doesn't appear for a subpoena, I mean, he's a partner at a law firm. Is that what they're teaching at the law firm, that when you get a subpoena, you don't have to show up? What I learned, and what most lawyers learn, is you got to show up. You can articulate your privilege that you won't answer questions when you show up, but you don't have the option not to show up. What law school are they teaching that in? So I'm concerned about that. The idea of judicial temperament. I didn't create judicial temperament. Civil rights lawyers didn't create judicial temperament. The ABA created the idea that judges should have judicial temperament, which means there's a certain way you behave on the bench. So when a judicial nominee loses it at a confirmation hearing, shouldn't you at least say something about how should we evaluate that?
Right. And a federal judge is attacked as not impartial because he's of Mexican
origin. When the president says says this judge is Mexican, first of all, Judge Curiel's Mexican American, that would be like the president saying, I'm African, right? Because I'm African American. And the president says he's Mexican and I'm building a wall, and therefore his decision is illegitimate because he cannot be impartial. That would have been a great moment for Chief Justice Roberts to say something. He said something when the president said there are Obama judges, and he said there are no Obama judges and Trump judges. But what about when the president accused a judge of being biased because the judge is Mexican American? So I'm really, you've touched on something that I've actually been trying to write something about it, and I've not regarded myself as sufficiently calm to write it in a way that in a way that I think it has to be written as a lawyer in this profession, to really essentially an open letter to my colleagues to say, where are you?
Do it. I think it's time. I think would you come down here and
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I want to thank you very much. I learned a whole lot from you that I knew nothing about, and I appreciate it. But I also want to talk about our area out here and let you know what the battle has been out here, where we were not allowed to buy homes in certain areas. And I want to mention someone here tonight who started an organization of 3 developments. And I came out as a young teenager back in 1942, and those developments weren't even there. I never thought I'd come out here again. I came out as a teenager to watch the little babies of my sister and in-laws. And I'm born in Harlem, born in a basement. Father was a janitor. My brother hauled the garbage from the dumbwaiters. We never thought we'd ever get out of Harlem. And here I am today in Sag Harbor. And I am proud to be out here, but I remember where we could not get into Levittown. My husband and I, he was a veteran. We couldn't get in because we were black. And we had to end up in South Jamaica to buy a house. But I also want to commend someone here today who started the SANS group of the 3 developments in Sag Harbor, which has just been designated a historic area. I want to introduce her, Renee Simon. We are now in historic area, thanks to her, because we couldn't buy out here before. We could not buy.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yes. My name is Rosa Hannah Scott. Oh, God, do I have Yes, I have something to think
We need
about.
a mic down here, I think. Oh, okay.
Yes. My name is Rosa Hannah Scott, and I had something to think about, and all of us should think about. Speaking of class, when they were speaking about the class and the slavery, at the time when we actually had slavery, even the poorest of whites could have a slave, and they did have slaves. So you can imagine what it was like through that period. And I just want the people here to think about the fact that Trump came here last week, and they said on television, oh, he didn't make $1 billion, but he did make 12 million. So that's a lot for us to think about when it comes time to vote and everything too. We really should. I'm not asking a question, but these two things I think are important, that the poorest of whites had slaves and that Trump made $12 million in 2 days. I'm sorry.
Can I ask as a point of privilege that the last question go to Gabrielle McDonald? Because Gabrielle Kirk McDonald was an LDF lawyer long before I was one, and when I became an LDF lawyer, I was 25, about
Don't say
100 pounds, and no, now we look the same age, which is concerning me. She was my first cooperating attorney. Gabrielle McDonald was an amazing civil rights lawyer and then federal judge in Texas, retired from the federal bench, and went to a law firm and then worked in international mediation, and then was a judge on the International Court Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And she was my cooperating attorney. At LDF, when you're a baby attorney, you got a cooperating attorney, a local counsel who was experienced, who worked with you, told you when to stand up and sit down and what to say. And that was this lady who's sitting right here.
And my baby grew up and grew very well. I don't have so much as a question, but something that I want to reveal to you about how in East Hampton there is a racial sharing of public space. And that is the benches. There are 2 benches in East Hampton for the jitney, which is the bus that we take into the city. One of them, and it's engraved, one of them says Rosa Parks, the mother of the civil rights movement. I think it was put there about maybe 8 years ago, not by the city, not by the owners of the jitney, but by, as I understand, Black Baptist Church here in East Hampton. But I use it as my opportunity for a little racial education. So I trot up with my gray hair, and I usually say, I'm going to sit with Rosa Parks. Well, you can imagine people kind of either look at me or ignore me. Or I will say, do you know who Rosa Parks is? Same reaction. So a little bit helps. It's unusual, and people probably don't know that that bench is here.
Okay. Everybody, thank you very much for coming. Sherrilyn Ifill, who calls America to its better self. Let's give her one last round of applause.